Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining the first webinar hosted by the Toronto Chinese Business Association in collaboration with the Young Executive Network in response to COVID-19 recovery for small and medium and sized enterprises. My name is Megan Ip, and I'm the president of the Young Executives Network. Without further delay, I would like to introduce our very special guest this evening. So we have Mayor John Tory of City of Toronto, and Raymond Chin, First Vice President of the Toronto Chinese Business Association, as well as Festival Chair for the 2021 Toronto International Dragon Boat Race Festival, who will be moderating the session this evening. So again, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Raymond, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Megan. As Megan said, my name is Raymond Chin, and I am a VP at the Toronto Chinese Business Association and the Festival Chair for the Toronto International Dragon Boat Race Festival. Let me first thank all of those who worked tirelessly to put on this event. So Gilbert Wong, our event chair, Megan Ip and Cindy Lee, our Young Executives Network president and VP, Teresa Chi, our TCBA president, and Bella Bao, our TCBA administrator, just to name a few. And of course, most of all, a man who needs no introduction, our Mayor John Tory. From when he first took office in 2014, he has consistently had Torontonians' best interests and needs in mind. It would take the entire hour, if not longer, to list the many projects and city initiatives that Mayor Tory has thrown his weight and support behind. But I can confidently say that he has made the City of Toronto a much better place for all of us. Because of his leadership, we can easily see that great future ahead. Obviously, 2020 has been a year of immense challenges, but clearly the overarching issue that is in all of our minds and is the topic of tonight's conversation is COVID-19. With almost 60 million cases and close to 1.4 million deaths worldwide, COVID-19 is clearly a worldwide pandemic and has been an example of how globalized our world has become. More locally, our provincial numbers have been in the range of 1,500 new cases per day, with Toronto making up about a third of that each day over the past few weeks. These numbers are obviously worrisome, but I'm confident that our government at all levels are making the right and difficult decisions to steer us back on course while we plan for the world to get back to normal. As an example of these difficult decisions that were needed, the City of Toronto just went into a 28-day lockdown today. It isn't all doom and gloom though. Within the past few weeks, we have heard promising news from large drug makers that an effective vaccine is on the horizon. The timeline and overall future of this pandemic is up to the powers and people higher than both of us, and this is the backdrop of our conversation today. Over the past few weeks, our event team for this fireside chat has solicited questions from the TCBA community and beyond. Questions have come from those in the industry and those affected by the industries alike. Our team has had a chance to pare down the list, and I have a set of questions that we'd like to focus on for our conversation tonight. I'd also like to add that we took the questions last week. Obviously, since then, the City of Toronto and Region of Peel have announced a lockdown, so I may slightly reword the questions, but try to keep the context. With that, I'd like to pass it on to Mayor Tory for a few comments before we start our questions. Mayor Tory?
Well, Raymond, thank you, and Megan, thank you, and Cindy, thank you, and one and all who are present for this webinar, thank you very much. And may I begin by saying I've got my fingers crossed for the Dragon Boat race for 2021, because I think if we're able to proceed ahead with that, it's a good indication, that things are much better by the time we get to next spring. And, I'm dearly hoping that, not just because there's going to be a vaccine on the horizon, which I gather is, promising, but just because I think everybody's been through a lot. And, I want to fasten on some other words that Raymond spoke, which is that, he was complimentary enough of me to say that I try to make decisions on the basis of what is best for the people of Toronto. I have had a lot of interesting jobs in my day, previously in government, but more importantly, in some ways in business, running a big company and things like that. And I have never faced the decisions that were as difficult as the ones that have been faced during the course of this pandemic. And that is because every decision you make has multiple sides to it. I mean, you worry about the effect it's going to have on people, individual people. Of course, you worry about the effect it's going to have on business, but overarching all of that has to be, what is the best thing you can do with respect to preserving health and saving lives in the city and protecting the healthcare system. And I can only say to you that, while you might say, well, it's easy to decide which policy, which approach, which kind of restriction will do the most to save lives, to protect health, and to protect the healthcare system. It's not easy because this is a virus, as you all know, that was discovered basically 11 months ago. There are still probably more unknowns than are known about it. And so you do your best based on the best evidence, the best advice you can get from experts, and based on what's going on in the rest of the world, best practices. And, I feel really badly about the lockdown that the province announced on Friday. I feel really badly about it because it's going to disrupt people's lives. But of course, it's going to do damage to businesses, some of which are represented, of course, on this very call. But at the same time, I don't comfort myself in seeing this, but I at least recognize the fact, as I hope you do, that pretty well every other major city, global city in the world has had a lockdown or some kind of a shutdown or partial shutdown like this, in order to, because that is, I guess, the best assessment of the people who give the advice as to what's going to help us stop numbers that were truly alarming. If you looked at I think you may have heard the medical officer of health saying today that 45% of all the COVID-19 cases that we've had in the city of Toronto have happened since October the 1st. So that's in a sort of a 6-week period out of a total of 10 months, 45% of the cases have happened. That was an alarming kind of trend. The growth in the case numbers, as you know, was increasing, the acceleration. The hospitals were starting to get some pressure on them. Our hospitals were better off than, say, in Peel, but they were starting to get some real pressure. And of course, with the kind of exponential growth, it's a very short matter of time before the hospitals are under such pressure that not only can they not care for the COVID people, but anybody who might have a heart condition or a stroke or a cancer operation can't be dealt with either. And then you're into the kind of chaos we've seen elsewhere. I have been a relentless advocate for programs to assist business. I think Chrystia Freeland would tell you that I'm probably one of her most frequent phone callers and texters. I spoke to her as recently as this morning. As you may saw, was after the Senate because I thought it was inexcusable. Frankly, they took a break week, as they called it, and didn't pass in one day the legislation that now people can apply for now, a week later, to get rent relief and to get wage subsidies to be continued. But those programs are there, the provincial programs are there, and I hope now they can both get, as I say, get the money out the door as soon as possible because businesses need that money to help them to survive. And I'm not going to speak for too much longer, but I also spoke today about the fact that I really want to make sure we do everything we can from the standpoint of traffic management to make sure this curbside option, together with online sales by local businesses as distinct from big businesses, can be a viable option so that people actually can make. I know they'll generally say when you can only have curbside or that kind of thing, it'd only be like 10% of the sales. But I think we'd love to get that up to a much higher number by saying to people the curbside option really is practical, the online option really is practical, and really push that so that people will think to use that. So I will stop there. I just want people to know, though, most of all, first of all, that I appreciate the contribution you make. I appreciate the number of jobs that you create, and I appreciate the damage that this entire pandemic and some of the restrictions meant to end it are causing you. I think you all know that there wouldn't be anybody in their right mind, least of all Doug Ford or myself, who would sit in our office and consciously try to think up ways in which we could resolve the pandemic on the backs of business people and sort of say, who cares about them? Too bad for them. It's been exactly the opposite. We've been trying to find every way we can to avoid that kind of situation, but it got to the stage in the last couple of weeks where we were faced with what I believe would have been a much longer and much broader and therefore much more damaging shutdown in the winter if we didn't act now to try and stem the tide of these numbers that were taking place. So I'm looking forward to your questions, no matter what they may be, and I'm quite prepared to accept criticism because that's in the nature of my job. But I do appreciate the fact you've given me this time this evening, and let's get on with the show.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Tory. So first question, we'll just hop right into it. I will sort of give a little bit of context to the questions, and I'll kind of mention who they're from or what industry they're from, and I hope maybe with that it'll help a little bit with the context of why somebody's asking that question. So our first question, Mayor Tory, is a question from one of our TCBA partners. With the rise in cases and current restrictions, what is the city doing to ensure compliance by restaurants and bars? The original question was asking about patios and how they often look like they're not in compliance, but maybe I'll reposition that a bit to be about the outside lineups and making sure that they're compliant and maybe mask wearing, whether that's compliant since it's locked down and the restaurants really aren't open anymore.
So that's a really good question. And there would be a time when I could have a fireside chat with you and you'd be saying to me, these inspectors are driving me crazy coming around all the time to do the health inspections. And why don't you tell them to busy themselves doing something else? And I think maybe because, I think our inspectors are not people who want to try and push people out of business. They generally give a fair number of warnings to people. We even have in the restaurant rating system, it doesn't go straight from green to red, and all that sort of thing. But what's happened during the pandemic is I think that kind of culture of giving people a lot of warnings and that kind of general practice in terms of how the law is enforced has been followed now for what I'll say is 11 months. And I've expressed there 10 months. I've expressed the view publicly, so you've probably heard me say so. The time for warnings is over. But I don't direct the law enforcement. We have a very good separation here in Canada between politicians and law enforcement, and the politicians do not tell the law enforcement people what to do, when to charge people, when not to charge them. And I think that's a good thing. It's a part of our democracy. However, I have been expressing my opinion more and more loudly in the last couple of months because I felt that by the time we got 6 or 7 months into this, the time for warnings was over. I'm pleased to tell you that I think as a result of the fact that with the numbers getting worse and worse, people started to realize the stakes were higher here. And I tried to find the sheet and I just couldn't before we started today, but I will tell you going from memory, about 90 restaurants were inspected this past weekend alone. There were, I think, 17 charges laid, which is an unusually high number. In previous weekends, it's been like 2 or 3 with a whole bunch of warnings given out. There were some warnings given this weekend. Private parties, which I realize is not what the question was about. I think there were about 50 or something of those complaints that were investigated by the police and by the bylaw people, and they gave some tickets and charged some people, and they're pretty hefty fines. So I think they're on to the fact now, I guess they heard my opinions. I'm not sure what influence, if any, that had, but I think what they've really figured out, the bylaw people and the police, is that if we're going to say the situation is so serious that we're actually going to cause businesses like yours, those on the call tonight, to be closed, more or less, I mean, subject to curbside pick up and takeout, then we've got to say those who are transgressing that, it's first of all, it's unfair to the rest of you who are following the rules. And secondly, it's just thumbing your nose at the law. And so I think you're going to see that this weekend's enforcement pattern, which was more numerous inspections, more numerous charges, fewer warnings, is going to be followed going forward. That's my sense from hearing from the law enforcement people. And they don't, as they say, ask me if that's okay. They just tell me that's what they're doing. And I have to sort of express my opinion and let them move on. So I think the point is taken. With regard to the lineup management, I think this is a very, very important thing the private sector is going to have to take on. And I say that with regard to restaurants, but also even more so the kind of some of these bigger stores that have been allowed to stay open and so on. The government doesn't have enough people to go around to every store and make sure that they're responsibly handling lineup management. And so I think it's up to the private sector. And one of the things we said today is we hope that the stores, big and small, don't have big Black Friday sales. Of course, the smaller stores can't let people in anyway, so they're not likely to do that unless they do it online, which is fine. But the big stores, I think they're going to have to be responsible for managing their own lineups as they were during the springtime shutdown. And so I hope people will take that responsibility seriously. It only involves putting some marks on the sidewalk. It involves us taking some steps, which I asked be examined, to make the sidewalks passable for people who have to get by when the lineup is there. And we'll be looking at that again because we did in the spring and I think it worked fairly well. But I think the main initiative there has to come from the private sector. And I can promise you, if somebody calls one of your businesses or anybody else to 311 and says at 463 Dundas Street West, there's a lineup that is, a crowd scene and people are too close and people are this and are that, we'll send somebody out because we're responding to all of those complaints because that's our job.
Great, thank you. This is a question from the restaurant industry. A recent report of infection rates in seniors' homes are over 30% and only 6% for the hospitality industry. Why are restrictions on seniors' homes more restrictive than in restaurants, bars, etc.? I think we should discuss more limitations on hospitality, such as max occupancy, persons per table, temperature checks, masks, etc., versus complete restrictions. Otherwise, by early next year, we'll see a large number of restaurants having to close or declare bankruptcy if they're not able to remain open.
Again, Raymond, thank you for the question, and thanks to the person that sent it in. And I understand the stakes are high. I understand the stakes are high because if this was just starting the first shutdown now, and we hadn't had one before, and we hadn't had the whole year's events, even in the summer when things were slower with regard to indoor dining when it was allowed, then people might be in better shape. But I understand what's happened is those who had reserves of any kind have expended them by now and probably have some things on their balance sheet that represent, say, rent that's been deferred or something like that, that is sitting there waiting to be dealt with. It's one of the reasons why I was such a loud advocate and a consistent advocate, as recently as this morning on the phone with Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, about the supports that are being offered. And just so you're clear, I think many of you will know, the new program that was just passed into law on Friday covers up to 90% of your rent, those that don't own their own premises, 90% of your rent if you're subject to a lockdown order, which you all are now. And secondly, it covers up to 65% of wages under the wage subsidy program. And I fully recognize I'm a business guy. So I know that if you still have very little or no revenue, even if somebody's paying 90% of your rent, it just means your loss is smaller as opposed to that you're going to be making money or even breaking even. But I think this will help people to sustain themselves through the 28-day period. Now, on the comparison between long-term care and restaurants, I can only say this: they're very, very different problems. The reason why there is such a spread or such a higher percentage of the cases that arise out of long-term care starts with the fact that the people who are in long-term care are frail to begin with. You know, they go in there because they need a lot of extra support and care. You then add to that two things, one of which we in our own residences, we own 10 of them, the city, we've rectified this one, which is that there was a pattern that had developed, I think in part because of the nature of how they did business, the long-term care residences, that would have people working in multiple homes on a part-time basis. So they might work 3 days a week at, home number A, and then work 2 days a week at home number B, and maybe even at a third one. That, of course, as you might expect, was almost a prescription for enhancing virus spread, simply because you had people moving from residence to residence to residence and coming into contact with people at all the different ones. In the case of the city residences, we have now achieved a 100% compliance with the fact that you have to choose one residence in which you work, and you are not allowed to work anywhere else. And that's cost us some money, and that we've had to pay people more, but fair enough. I think that was a price that was well worth paying if it was going to help to save lives. The part that has been more difficult to deal with, to be perfectly honest with you, is that many of the homes built in the 70s and 80s were homes that had 2 and 3 and sometimes even 4 people in a room. And of course, nowadays, you just don't have that in hospitals either. In hospitals, it's very rare to find a room like that because they've realized that the infection containment is best achieved by people having, albeit maybe smaller rooms, having a private room, or at the most a semi-private room. Unfortunately, with the long-term care, until you replace those buildings, and we've replaced at least a couple of ours now, up at Kipling Acres, we've done a complete renovation to get rid of pretty well all of those rooms. The ones that are still around, ours and the private sectors, have many of these multiple resident rooms. And there's only, as you know, with a building, many of you have a certain square footage you can deal with in your businesses. You can move people, as we've done, to the recreation room and the common room and set up kind of makeshift arrangements for them there, but there's only so many of those people you can move. And it's very difficult to move them from building to building in the city's portfolio of 10 because they're very frail. And to move often is something that's just too much for them to undertake. So we've done various other things to dramatically increase infection control in the long-term care. But I would just say it's a misguided kind of comparison to say, well, we're being twice as strict on restaurants as we are on long-term care. We're being as strict as we possibly can be on long-term care. On restaurants, the medical officer of health, and I'll finish on this point, the medical officer of health has said this quite a few times, and it's really worth focusing on. Her intention, and by my accepting her advice, which I've tried to do because she's the expert that's appointed that knows all about health and medicine and science, which I don't. I'm a lawyer and a businessman. Her intention on dealing with restaurants and gyms isn't because she thinks those places are places where everybody who goes in the door comes out with COVID-19. It is rather that she has said from the beginning, and I do accept this part, that the less we can have people be in contact with each other, the better. That's why our principal advice we've said to people, regardless of the rules, is please stay home. We'd rather people didn't frankly go out for dinner at all, even if the restaurants were open right now, because we don't want the virus to spread. And she makes the point, and I accept it because I've been out for dinner since the pandemic started myself. And when you sit at a table for 4 and you take your mask off, perhaps when you've sat down, or certainly when you're eating or drinking, even though the restaurants were doing a great job of compliance, you are increasing the risk if somebody is sitting there without knowing they have COVID-19 at that table for 4, and they're not people you live with, you are increasing the chances of somebody getting the virus. And we did have, and I have the notes here somewhere, we had potential exposures because of one case in a restaurant on a staff member or a customer of 600 potential exposures. We then had to try and track down with phone calls and detective work to see how many of those people came down with COVID-19 and how many of them should get tested. So look, it is never meant to say that restaurants and bars, as distinct from gyms or as distinct from long-term care or as distinct from stores, were the culprit. Nobody was saying that. But what the medical officer of health was saying is that she, in advocating the measures she did, and the province in making the decisions it made, were simply trying to cut down on the contact people had with others, because the less contact you had, and I said I'd finish on this one point, but I will finish, I promise, on this one. When we brought in the original measures that cut the dining down to the Toronto alone cut down indoor dining maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, the number of average contacts reported by people who tested positive for the vaccine or for the virus dropped from, going from memory, 25 contacts people would report down to like 7. So they worked those contacts in terms of reducing contact that people had. And by the way, the case count per 100,000 in the neighborhood of the waterfront and little Portugal, the neighborhood around College Street, dropped down hugely dropped down. And it's because people weren't given a place to go and socialize. And it seems very unfair that the effect it's had on restaurants, but that is the reasoning why it was done. And that's the reasoning why there's a difference between long-term care, which is, I assure you, highly regulated in many respects you probably don't even know, and restaurants, which were actually doing their best to comply with the rules.
Okay, thank you. And just a quick note for the participants who have logged in. We've already vetted the questions. I don't know if some people showed up late. I'll just repeat it again. We've already vetted the questions and we've talked through some of the questions. If you do have further questions, just send them off to us, or you can leave them in the chat. They most likely will not get answered tonight, but we will try our best to address some of those questions if we can. So the third question is another question from the restaurant industry, Mayor Tory. We understand the adverse effect of COVID-19 and respect public health officials doing their best to protect the general public. What can the city do to help our restaurant customers and workers get a better handle and avoid being the source of spreading the virus? We need to find a happy median, as you mentioned, that will help the restaurants remain open while keeping the employment stable and strong.
Well, if I can sort of look at the glass as being even a quarter full, I won't call it a half full, but the period of time when we're going to have this terribly difficult closure for restaurants is 28 days. It's now down to 27 days. So each day will take one off that total, and there is a brighter day ahead when the restaurants can reopen. And if I had any advice to offer, and I don't know the circumstances in which the restaurants will reopen, will we go from the gray lockdown back to red or to yellow, or I don't know. But I will say this, I think that I would say, from what I've heard from our medical officer, the main thing that restaurants and other businesses can do is to really pay a lot of attention to their staff. And it's sort of like long-term care. If the people are coming in to work in the restaurant and they've been out doing various things, even just socializing and leading a normal life, or if they work, as often people do, I know, in more than one place, where they're more likely to catch COVID-19, this is a problem that I think restaurateurs are going to have to keep an eye on. And then number two, I think it is evident from what's happened in other businesses, including, but not limited by any means to restaurants, that when these viruses transmit, they're transmitting more likely when people are sitting around, say in the staff room or in the kitchen after hours, having a bite to eat because they're tired and they've worked, or being in close quarters in the kitchen or things like that. And I think what we're going to have to focus on more relentlessly than ever when we come back to business is that kind of, avoiding that kind of situation, training the staff as best one can to avoid circumstances where they're coming into contact with a lot of people if they're going to work in a business as sensitive as food service. And I think it's going to be then maybe adopting a regime with respect to things like mask wearing, where we say to people, and I will confess to you freely, I was not doing this myself before even outdoor dining was closed, to say, look, yes, of course you could take off your mask to eat your food, and you don't have to take it off between every single bite. But when you're sitting looking at the menu, when you're waiting for your food to come and you're having chit chat, leave your mask on, please. Because a lot of people weren't. I mean, I saw it myself. I did it myself. I'll confess to that, where you take it off when you sat down at the table thinking we're outside. We were told that was okay. I'm sitting here with my friends, and they're my friends, but they weren't my family necessarily. And it's okay to take it off. And nobody sort of said it wasn't. We even didn't say it wasn't. We sort of said, well, wear it in when you go in, wear it when you sit down, wear it when you get up to go out or go to the washroom, but you don't have to sort of keep it on when you're at the table. So I think there's going to be a lot of things we're going to have to do. I think we are going to try again, and this is more light at the end of the tunnel as opposed to something immediate. We will leave in place for those who can take advantage of it. And I realize it's not going to be everybody, but I think people are more of a mind now to think about eating outside on even a nice winter day where, you know, the temperature can be 0, and it can be, if you're dressed properly and you have some protection, people can think about that. But I think more importantly, what they want to know is, can they be secure in the knowledge that next summer, all the patio arrangements we made to give people extra latitude to make extra revenue will be there, and that those things will be there, that the ease of applying and getting those things will be there. So we won't be tying people up in endless baloney, you know, making application for these things. We did it pretty quickly, I think, this summer, that they'll know that stuff will be there, so that they'll know if they can make it through the winter. By the way, we didn't have, and I don't know how many of your members would belong to Winterlicious and be part of that. We didn't have it, and we didn't have Summerlicious, so we've got all the money set aside to have something, but we didn't launch it on purpose this fall, and thank goodness we didn't, because we were talking about launching it like a week before we shut the restaurants down, and that would have been a stupid waste of money. So we're saving that to put on a great Dine Local campaign. There was one all ready to go with Destination TO, the tourism group. We had ads produced and everything to say to people, go and support your local restaurant. And there was going to be packages put together through the BIAs and so forth. So we're going to do all of that to support you, those in the restaurant business. But I think you're going to have to sort of do even better at making sure the best health practices are followed. And you're going to have to be really rigid in making sure that if an employee even shows any sign of sneezing, you know, I mean, without getting carried away, that you say to them, I'm sorry. I mean, we just can't have you working. You better go get tested, or at least go home until you're feeling better, because I think that's been a part of this too. There've been people who have come to work because they needed the money, and I get that. And they're afraid to get tested because they think their employer will say, well, your job's gone or your paycheck's gone. And we're going to have to find ways with the government's help to make sure people are not feeling afraid to get tested for that reason.
Yep. Mayor Tory, this is a question from the real estate industry. With regards to the City of Toronto's homeless situation and how it affects small businesses, many of our landlord tenants have concerns regarding the city's increasing homelessness issue. Many in the Yonge and Bloor area, for example, have expressed their concerns that there are many encampments and homeless people loitering in front of their businesses or nearby. Many patrons do not feel safe and often avoid the businesses in those areas. With the majority of businesses requiring lineups outside because of COVID, what can the City of Toronto do to help resolve the homeless issue and support small business owners?
Well, this is a housing problem as much as anything else. And of course, it leads to some of the safety and other kinds of concerns that were expressed by the questioner. And I thank you very much for the question. So the first thing we could be doing, which we're doing as a city at a pace not done before for decades, is building more affordable and supportive housing. Supportive housing is equally important, doesn't get talked about as much. Supportive housing is for people who have mental health issues or drug dependency issues, because they need not just affordable housing, but they need housing where there's people that are going to support them to get over some of their issues. And we are drastically short of that. It should be part of the healthcare system, to be quite frank, and it is the responsibility of the provincial government. We have been moving quite aggressively to seek out programs which the federal government has responded to, I will say. They have something, for example, called the Rapid Housing Initiative, which is going to allow us as a city government to buy hotels. And there are going to be some hotels for sale now simply because of the difficulties they've been through with the pandemic. And we will actually buy some of those hotels or properties like that and turn them into supportive housing, so that we have a place to have people live with the supports they need and not live in tent encampments. Now, the Toronto, for better or for worse, is the center of this region. And you know, the region has almost 7 million people. If you looked at all the other municipalities in the region, you know, Markham, Vaughan, Mississauga, Brampton, they have almost no shelter capacity at all. So what tends to happen, and I think it's just the way things work, is that people come to the big city, the biggest one, to seek shelter or to seek other needs they might have. We have a shelter system consisting of 75 shelters plus respite sites, 75 shelters. They every night shelter 6,000 people. Now, 6,000 sounds like a gigantic number. It's a city of 3 million in a region of 6 million. Most of the rest of the region doesn't have any shelter system at all. So we end up being the default shelter system for the region. We, by the way, pay most of the cost of operating it, and there's no contribution made whatsoever by Brampton, Mississauga, Markham, or any of those places. And I've raised objection to that because I think that's not fair. The Toronto taxpayers and Toronto businesses should pay for that. During the pandemic, we were forced to make some serious changes because even those shelters that existed did not have people spaced 2 meters apart. So we literally have had to move during the pandemic 3,000 people to alternate accommodations so that they could be in a space where they were spaced 2 meters apart at least. We've done that by using every means at our disposal: empty Toronto community housing apartments we found and gave a housing allowance, hotels in some cases. What has happened though is that some of the people who were not going to stay in the shelters because we couldn't keep them all in the same place they'd sometimes lived for a long time went to the encampments. Oftentimes they tended to be people with a more acute version of some of these mental health issues or substance use challenges. And so the encampment sprung up. We took the position from the beginning that we were not going to sort of bulldoze the encampments as they might do in some other cities, not in our country, but elsewhere. What we were going to do is adopt the following policy. And I'm giving you a very complete answers to all these things because you're business people and you will want those complete answers and deserve them. We adopted a policy that has been uniformly used in the city, certainly since the time I've been mayor, and I think before, and we're using it now, where we go to these encampments, which we believe should not be located in public parks, period. And because we know we can't just sort of bulldoze them and shouldn't treat people that way, we give notice. The notice has generally been in the order of about 2 weeks, where we say this encampment can't continue to be here. We are going to sit down with each and every one of you and say there's 50 people living in an encampment. The average size of the larger ones has been 50 or so. We're going to sit and talk with each of you and offer you all kinds of different forms of housing that we can give you, whether it is a hotel room or a spot in a shelter or an affordable apartment we have or some supportive housing. Through that offer, we have thus far housed 1,100 people. We estimate there's about 400 left in encampments today. The biggest challenge that we faced from the encampments has not been so much the problems that exist in the encampment themselves, because they are unsafe. We've had 89 fires this year, for example, in those encampments that had to have the fire department called. We had one person die from a fire. We've had many, many calls that relate to the health and safety otherwise of these encampments, because if you think about it, they don't have proper plumbing and washroom facilities and so forth. But as big a problem as all of those has been what's gone on outside of the encampment. So in other words, you have people that are living in a place where they're not intended to be living. They don't have any of the supports they need for those who need special supports because they have mental illness or drug use issues. And they are living in a circumstance that doesn't have any of the basic supports of life, whether it's a washroom or even proper food or just basic safety and fire safety. So we've been trying by deploying outreach workers around areas where this has happened. And at Yonge and Bloor, we have a respite site that's been controversial as well, because there's been some upset take place outside. To deal with that, I think in instances where we've applied the right resources, things have quieted down. But I will finish on this note. And I know I always say that and don't, but on this one I will. I've been asked in some of the neighborhood controversies that have arisen from businesses and from just people who are the customers of those businesses to say, well, you're going to have to choose between the homeless, vulnerable people and the kind of peace and quiet of neighborhoods, including smaller businesses. I can't make that choice. I have an obligation in my job. I'm responsible to all 3 million people who live in Toronto, including homeless people. They're just people with problems, with issues in their lives. They're not bad people. They're just people that are homeless, the people who have drug use problems, and people who have mental health issues. And so I can't say that, well, I'm going to abandon them in favor of keeping things more tranquil in these neighborhoods. I have an obligation to say we're going to shelter these people as best we can. It's not always easy to find a place. You know, it's a big city that's busy and fortunately full of people who are doing business and living in places. There's not a lot of vacancy, but we've been trying our best to make sure that when we do establish a new shelter, that we do it in a way that provides for what goes on outside, meaning that when the residents are outside of the shelter, they are not causing undue upset to businesses or to local residents. So we will continue to do that. We will continue to find permanent housing for as many of these people as quickly as we can. But please understand, these are our fellow residents of Toronto who are homeless and who are facing desperate circumstances in their lives. And we have an obligation as a city government to help them. And we have to help them wherever and whenever we can. And that's what we're doing. And I realize there has been that kind of disruption the questioner described. We're trying our best to minimize that, and we're having some success with that. So we'll carry on doing that.
Great, thank you. This is a question from the insurance industry. I'm just going to switch gears a little bit here. What resources does the city have to help with digital education and support for people that are not too tech savvy, particularly with long-time small business owners who are older and are having a more difficult time with transitioning to a digital platform? What can Toronto do to help with these small business owners?
So we created something a couple of years ago before the pandemic called the Digital Main Street Program, and the purpose of it, and we did it in conjunction with the BIAs. The purpose of it was to address exactly what you talked about. I was shocked. I came from, essentially to being there. I'd been a broadcaster for a bit, but I was running Rogers, where I just accepted the fact everybody had access to the internet, and there wasn't any business that was other than, the smallest of small stores that didn't have at least a website. I was wrong. There were many, many, many businesses, I think for the reason that you mentioned, that, where the founders and the owners didn't have, it was all they could do to muster, sending a text on a phone, as opposed to having any kind of complicated e-commerce presence in their stores. And of course, forgetting about the pandemic, retail, as you all know better than me, was changing anyway to go in the direction of online shopping because people found that convenience, and it is. So we invented the Digital Main Street Program, and the purpose of it was in non-pandemic times to get as many businesses online with the assistance of the city, so that we were essentially paying the people who were the experts to get these businesses online. When the pandemic hit, we came up with a second program and really bolstered the private sector resources that were behind the program. It was called Shop Here. And the purpose of it was, the way it worked was, we essentially got volunteers, many of whom were like students that were in the complicated kind of web design courses at Sheridan College. We got companies, Google, Microsoft, trying to think who else was involved. I'm forgetting one that's really important, but Google, Microsoft to name two. And we got them to combine forces with the city to essentially make the resources available from those companies and those students and web designers who were like professional web designers to get as many businesses online as we could during the pandemic. The number is over 8,000 and just under 10,000 now that have gone on since the pandemic from this Shop Here program. Any of you on the line tonight were eligible to apply to be part of that program, and it's still going. In fact, it was so successful that it was taken national by the federal government, who helped to supply the funding to pay for these web designers and others to be able to offer for free the creation of an e-commerce store. We didn't just say we'll give you some kind of a crappy website. We said we will give you a functioning e-commerce store out of this exercise for nothing. So as I say, somewhere north of 8,000 and I think just now south of 10,000 businesses are online today with an e-commerce platform. And of course, that not only, and they did the instruction that went with it, so that even the most, look, I'm 66 years old, so I can use technology to a certain extent, but like most 66-year-olds, I'm not as comfortable as my son or even my grandson is with it. I mean, they just second nature to them. But I think most shopkeepers, given the instruction by Shop Here and Digital Main Street, have found themselves comfortable using the e-commerce. And of course, the people that have to be really comfortable with it are the customers, and they're pretty comfortable, buying things online. So the key is to get these smaller businesses online so that they can not only deal with their own existing customers who at the moment during the shutdown can't come in the store, but also then to open yourself up to the rest of the world. And I've heard of independent jewelry stores, for example, that were really struggling in Toronto because they were independent, they were small, customers were going online. And once they took themselves online, they not only were able to communicate with their, traditional customers back and forth and sell things, but they were selling things to people in Calgary or in Berlin or in London because they had a nice piece of jewelry they designed and somebody saw it online and liked it. So I'm just saying to you, that has been our principal effort with the involvement of business students, web developers, and these big companies. Another thing I'll mention is our partnership between Ritual, which is a food, it's an app that helps to sort of organize people. We used it one time to sell ferry tickets for the Toronto Island Ferry, speaking of the Dragon Boat race. But Ritual and DoorDash came together with the city to form a kind of a commission-free ability that people could have to have their food delivered to help restaurants, so they weren't paying these outrageous commissions. I hope you heard me complaining about them on the part of Uber, 30% off the top for a takeout meal, which would leave you with negative profit margin, let alone making a penny. So we formed partnerships like that were deliberately designed to help these businesses to take advantage of technology without having to know anything about technology yourself. And then finally, I'll say technologically, we did things like the Cafe TO patios and stuff like that to allow more revenue production to happen in the summer months. and allow the winter patios to continue where that's applicable for people who wanted to take advantage of that. But the technology has been a very important part of what we tried to do. Pardon me, and not only have those programs been taken national, we're continuing with them and expanding them because we believe the more businesses we can get online, the more viable they're going to be, pandemic or not, to surviving in the long term.
Yep. This is a question from a TCBA partner. I've heard of and seen many situations where people go to nearby regions when their own region has locked down or entered into a more strict phase of pandemic control. Particularly now with Toronto and PO locked down, but nearby Durham, Halton, and York in the red zone, what plans are in place to work with the other GTA mayors to coordinate COVID control measures? So for example, like lockdowns, entry into new stages, etc.
Well, it's interesting because I chair a meeting of the local mayors and regional chairs every week on Monday from across this region. And we discussed this very matter today. And I'll be honest with you in answering and saying that our power as mayors and chairs to impose, say, travel restrictions on people moving back and forth between, say, City of Toronto and York region or City of Toronto and Peel, we don't have any such powers. The only government that has the power to impose restrictions like that is the province. They have so far said they discourage people from traveling between regions, especially regions that are hotspots like Toronto and a region that is not yet a hotspot like York. I mean, it's kind of red, but it's getting hotter, but it's not lockdown. Today, as mayors, we put out our weekly statement and we said that we strongly discourage people from traveling between regions. The Mayor Frank Scarpitti of Markham, for example, said quite outwardly, as much as he knew his businesses could benefit from people showing up to shop in York region because those stores are not shut down yet. He said, no, look, we don't want you to come because we both don't want the virus to spread into York region, but we also understand it's unfair to the Toronto businesses to have people able to go across Steeles Avenue and suddenly able to go shopping. So I would say to you that we're going to be engaging in some degree of public education because we don't want people. I mean, the basic advice we're trying to give people over and over and over again, and I'm about to give it again, stay home. We're not saying it's okay to go to Newmarket to shop or it's okay to go to Burlington to shop. We're saying stay home. We don't even want people to go shopping in Toronto. We want them to go shopping once a week in Toronto to get their groceries by themselves so it's not a family outing. We want them to do the rest of their shopping either by curbside pickup, which is safe, or by online ordering. And they can do hopefully both. The more of the local businesses that are online, the more they can buy from local businesses as opposed to multinationals. And I've got nothing against multinational companies. But right now, and I said this in my statement today as well, we've got to support our local businesses. We're thinking even of putting on a big campaign that encourages people as Christmas presents to get gift certificates or gift cards to local businesses so that even if you don't go buy a present in a local store, you can get a gift card or gift certificate from that store so that when people go out and spend after Christmas, they'll be spending money in the local stores. And I think that's something that we could mount a good campaign with the BIAs on that. But I'm just being honest and saying to you, we do not have the power to ban interregional travel for shopping. I think you may find one or more of these regions may go into a lockdown themselves before too long. And I don't wish that on them, but I'm just saying I think their numbers are getting worse, in which case they'll be in the same boat as us. But for the moment, we're certainly discouraging people from traveling to the other regions to shop. And I hope most people pay attention to that.
Yep. This is a question from the real estate industry. In terms of business support when the pandemic is over, are there discussions of specific programs for business owners that have had to close down during the pandemic and want to restart?
Not yet. I will say that I think there's a recognition that especially downtown, because the downtown has been hit in two respects. I mean, one is they faced all the same challenges everybody else in the city has faced in terms of coping with an environment in which people are being encouraged to stay home and where they were shut down for periods of time and so on. But secondly, the businesses downtown have been badly hurt by the fact people are not coming to work downtown. I think there's something in the order of 500,000 plus people who come to work in downtown Toronto every day. And there's another group, again, 6 figures like that live downtown and walk to work. But there's lots of other people who take the transit downtown to work and they're just not coming. So I think you all know that whether it's on Spadina in the Chinese business community or Dundas or any of that area, or whether it's underneath the office towers, those businesses are in trouble because they're seeing some of the local residents who live around there shop and do business, but they're not seeing the day-to-day business of people who work downtown. And so just as I think the federal and provincial governments have recognized what the businesses told me when I had quite a few roundtables was a real liquidity problem they had even after the spring months. I think the federal and provincial governments will understand there's a liquidity problem that exists after the pandemic is over, which I hope will be sometime next spring, that it's reached a stage where we can resume somewhat more normal businesses. And I think there are going to have to be steps taken in conjunction with the banks and with the businesses themselves and the governments to try and help address some of those issues, even if it's by way of some low-cost loans or something like that, that allow people to have lower cost financing than they would get if they got it from the bank. I think in the meantime, though, the reason behind these government supports for the 90% of rent and the 65% of wages and so on is to help people hang on. Because we kind of know those things in and of themselves, as I mentioned earlier, are not going to cause people to suddenly be profitable, far from it. But I think that subsidy, plus the takeout and delivery business, plus a resumption of some degree of indoor dining come the end of the pandemic shutdown period, the 28 days, should give people a chance to have a fighting chance to get through to the spring, when everything seems to suggest a vaccine will be available. Once that starts to happen, of course, then you'll have a much safer environment in which these people can do business. But I would only have to say, with regard to specific measures to help people that are financial in nature, that will have to await the actual ending of the pandemic per se, or the receding of the case count as that starts to happen. I will only tell you, final comment, I am in touch with Rod Phillips, the provincial finance minister, the premier, and Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister and finance minister. I would say it's not an exaggeration to say maybe not quite daily, but say 5 out of 7 days of the week. And they know how keenly I have my finger on the pulse of what business is going through here, and how important that is to the rest of the country, not just to Toronto. Toronto is the economic engine of the country. And if our whole small business community kind of collapses under its own weight because of all this, we will be doing a great damage to the whole country, not just to our own city. So they know that. And I think that they're going to be willing to continue to listen, as they have from the beginning, to me and to others in this region, to provide the support that's necessary to help the economy here get back on its feet.
Okay. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but this is another question from the real estate industry. In order for small businesses in the core to survive and bounce back, there needs to be people living downtown. We've seen a movement of residents from the core to the suburbs, given more work flexibility and a less busy lifestyle. As a result, downtown small business owners are feeling an extra burden. What can the city do to help encourage people to move back downtown and thus support small businesses?
Well, I think, the biggest challenge we have in front of us at the moment is just to get people to be back at work, downtown. And I think that will kind of make the downtown the kind of vibrant magnet for people that it is to live as well. I don't think the sort of inherent pessimism, and I don't mean to be critical of the questioner, I don't think the inherent pessimism in the question is well founded. When you talk to people that are in the development industry, the biggest challenge they face at the moment in terms of their condos, and you've seen the rents dropping on condos because the supply has dramatically increased. It didn't dramatically increase because of an exodus of people moving out of the city. It dramatically increased because all the formerly Airbnb condos, which we don't allow anymore under our regulations, were suddenly, owned by investors who thought they could rent them out indefinitely to Airbnb and found they couldn't. So I think you're seeing a short-term, I don't want to call it a flooding of the market. You're seeing a short-term increase in supply in the market. The second factor you have to take into account is that immigration has been shut off for 6 or 7 months. If you assume that Toronto was taking in 100,000 people a year, and 7 out of 12 months would be, say, 60,000 of those people have not come here this year. 60,000 people who otherwise would have been looking for a place to live in the city and often ended up renting condos. And if you finally talk to the development people about the plans they have for Toronto and for downtown Toronto in particular, they have as many plans as ever. We actually have in the pipeline now approved in the city of Toronto, like dozens and dozens of developments. Now, will they proceed right away until things stabilize? Not necessarily. Will they proceed when the people have bought the land, spent the time on the approvals, in some cases even begun to market those projects? Yes, they will proceed eventually, because Toronto was, before the pandemic hit, the fastest growing city in North America. I predict to you with great confidence that because of the smart people, the tech sector, the financial services sector, the life sciences sector, every major sector, we're one of the top 3 or 4 players in North America, and sometimes top 10 in the world. That's all still there. The smart people are still here. Toronto's still a magnet for people who come with expertise in artificial intelligence and many things, life sciences. You think about it for a moment. If you were a young person sitting in Hamburg, Germany, and you had a choice between taking a job in Toronto, New York, or London, based on their experience in fighting the pandemic and just based on the prospects, quality of life overall, and so on, which one would you pick? Now, not 100% of them will pick Toronto, but I think we would punch above our weight in terms of getting more than our share today because people recognize we've handled the pandemic well. I hope we will continue to. We've got a lot of smart people, excellent educational institutions, and great companies here. So I'm very bullish on Toronto's future because I think the circumstances that had us the fastest growing city in North America, one of the top 6 in quality of life in the world, will still be there when we finish, and that when we finish the pandemic, and that we can then make sure that downtown is an attractive place to live. And the people who want to live downtown these days are young people. They make up a lot of these tech firms, film industry, production firms, and so on. And they will still want to walk to work. That's what they want to do. They want to walk or bike to work. They don't want to have an hour's commute on the transit system. They'll be back. Most of them haven't left. And I think you'll find that downtown will be just as attractive a place to work as ever, to live as ever. And in fact, if the rents drop, it'll be more attractive than it was before. And the apartments will fill up very quickly. The law of supply and demand does work. As you all know, you're business people.
Yep. This is a question from a TCBA partner. Tracing and quick testing are essential to managing this pandemic. How do we handle it effectively?
It's been a real challenge for us. I spent an extensive period of time this morning on a meeting on that score because I'll be very, very honest with you all on this. I don't know if there's any media people listening to this or not, but it doesn't matter. First of all, we've been uneven in our performance on testing. When I say we, it's a provincial responsibility. And I think the province started off, as you might remember, if you go all the way back, and it's hard to remember back at the beginning of this pandemic, but at the beginning, we were doing like 3,000 tests a day. And that was way below the capacity we had as a province and way below what was necessary to keep up with this thing. So you remember they dramatically increased the capacity. And then the premier said one day, well, anybody who wants to get a test should just show up and get one. Well, people took his word on that, showed up and got a test. And what was happening was you had tens of thousands of people suddenly being tested every day compared to 3,000, but they were not the right people to be getting tested. The right people to be getting tested were people in high risk circumstances, living in higher risk neighborhoods and so on like that, whereas you had a lot of people that were showing up multiple times to get tested because they thought they should. What then happened was that when you got these 30, 40, 50,000 tests a day being done, a backlog developed. That started to put serious pressure on contact tracing, where I should tell you, we went from 50 people doing contact tracing, working for Toronto Public Health at the beginning of the pandemic, to today, 800. But the problem was, as you had 40,000 people getting tested, and as the province failed to meet its own target of being able to be in a position where they could give us the results in 24 hours, or at the most 48 hours, it started to be 5 or 6 or 7 days. And you can imagine if you're doing detective work, and you're phoning people that caught the virus maybe 10, 12 days ago, took the test 6 days ago. Now you have the results and you're phoning them up and saying, Raymond, what did you do in the 7 days before you got COVID-19, which might be 3 weeks ago? What did you do in the 14 days? And Raymond might not even remember what he did yesterday, let alone what happened 14 days ago. So what started to happen was that the contact tracing regime started to become less effective for those kinds of reasons. A backlog developed. And so what the city did is it went back to saying we're going to contact trace the highest risk people because we know we can get those done fairly quickly. We're now in the middle of ramping up our capacity back up to the point where it might involve having 1,200 of those contact tracers instead of 800. We're doing that. And we are urging the province to do even more testing because what's going on is the testing was taking place not in the neighborhoods where it's most badly needed, which is the neighborhoods that have a very high positive test rate and very low test results. So we've got to get more testing done in those neighborhoods where, frankly, you may have heard me talking about sick pay today. That's one of the reasons we have to say to people, you will not have to be made to do without your pay if you're forced to isolate because you test positive. Because a lot of people are scared to get the test, not because they're scared of having something put in their nose, but because they're afraid if they test positive, they will have to take time off work for which they will not be paid and they'll have no money to feed their family. It's as simple as that. People have told us that. They're afraid to get tested for that reason. That is no reason to have people going to work sick, which is what they're doing. They have a sore throat. They go to work, oh, well, I'm not going to get tested because if I got tested and I was positive, I'd have to quarantine for 14 days and I would then not get paid. So that's why you've heard all the talk about sick days, and you will continue to hear it from me because I think it is unreasonable that the other governments would not provide for some kind of a program, perhaps in partnership with the private sector, to make sure that everybody can confidently get tested, knowing they will not lose their job or their paycheck for the 2 weeks that they're required to isolate after they get tested positive.
Yeah. This is another question from a TCBA partner, and looking at the time, it might be our last question. How can I ready my business to apply for government financial support?
Well, I think, you know, the government is trying to make it as easy as possible for these applications to happen. And by the way, just in case you were not aware of this, the aid with 90% of the rent if you're shut down, and the aid with the wage subsidies will now go to the company, to the business, not to the landlord, the rent money. The rent before, as you'll recall, the previous program didn't work, frankly, because a lot of landlords refused to apply. It was crazy. And yet the businesses are still sitting there being charged the rent and having to sometimes defer it or even pay it, even worse right now. So this aid with 90% of the rent will go to the business. And all I would suggest is they're trying to make the application process as simple as possible, as quick as possible, like the CERB, you know, where they sort of benefit in favor of giving you the money and checking up on the audit trail later. But that what you can do, because there are some numbers you have to provide that show you qualify as a smaller business who they're trying to help, to have your numbers ready. So I would say the application forms are now available. I would have said this last week if I'd been here. Spend a bit of time getting yourself organized so that the kinds of questions they ask you about the diminished revenues, so you have to go back and look at your revenues a year ago and say, all right, what was it a year ago? What is it now? And have that information available for them so it's clear that you qualify. And they're not being, you know, big sticklers about that in terms of saying we have to have every T dotted and every I crossed, but they are going to ask for that basic information from you. And I would just have that ready, because the programs are supposed to be user friendly, and they're supposed to use your what do you call it, CRA, Canada Revenue Account, like that account, to flow the money to you, so that they're not cutting a check and having it sitting around waiting for it to be processed by the computer. They're supposed to literally process your application once it's received, and the money would then go directly into your CRA account, through which you submit your your withholdings and all that stuff. So they've pledged, and Krista Freeland has told me they've made a huge effort to make this user friendly. We'll see. They've done pretty well so far with the CERB and so forth. I think those were reasonably user friendly, but I think the best thing you can do is get ready with the facts and figures about revenue losses, you know, the wage subsidies, the precise details of who's who and what they get paid. Get the documentation that shows your rent, you know, who the landlord is and what the rent is. Just a copy of the lease would probably be suffice, but you know, you just got to have that stuff ready instead of starting to collect it the day you want to put in your application, because you need certain evidence like that. Obviously, they can't just send you a check based on your say so. So they just need some basic evidence showing you qualify. Probably got time to take one more, and then we will have to go.
Right. Let's try one more question here. This is a question from the insurance industry. Seems that the retail sector support only has programs, or has a majority of their programs, for delivery services, which may benefit the restaurant sector. What kind of support is available for sectors that provide face-to-face services, such as spa services or hair salon and nails?
I stand to be corrected on this, but I don't think I'm wrong in saying that the program I've described that helps with the rent and helps with the wage subsidy applies to smaller businesses. And the threshold isn't what business are you in? Are you a restaurant or a jewelry store or a spa? The question is, what is your revenue? What is your revenue size? Because they're trying to help smaller business. And I think I'm right in saying that other businesses of a retail nature are covered by that program that can subsidize the rent and can subsidize the wages. The wage subsidy program is the same one that's existed all the way through, and it certainly did not apply only to restaurants. It applied to other smaller businesses. The new rent program that allows the rent to be subsidized directly to the business is applicable, I believe, I'm 99% certain of this, to all smaller businesses. The only key is you have to be small. In other words, you can't be some huge multinational or a big chain of restaurants, because they were trying to benefit the ones that would be struggling the most.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. And as we have come close to the end of the session this evening, I would like to take a moment to thank Mayor Tory for speaking to us this evening and providing us with much clarity in these times of crisis. Just before we sign off, may I please ask Mayor Tory and Raymond to smile for the camera as we're going to take a screenshot for the social media. All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Wonderful. Thank you very much. So just before we sign up, Yes, Mayor.
Well, Megan, I hope you're going to give me a chance just to say thank you. Were you going to give me that chance? Because otherwise I'd do it
Of
now.
course. I was just going to pass the floor back to Raymond and yourself for the closing remarks. So please, over to you.
Okay, well, we'll let Raymond have the last word because it's your organization. You should have the last word. And Megan, thank you for your role. And thank you to the Young Executive Network. I think it is wonderful. There is such a thing. These are the leaders of today and the future and have ideas on. They can be the ones that can lead the way on the technology, frankly, where some of us are a little more behind on that. May I just say thank you to the business people who are sending in the questions and who listened tonight and say this to you. Please have hope. I know it's difficult right now because you'll feel that you've been sort of particularly singled out for sort of negative attention. I told you what the medical officer's motive was, which was to stop or reduce substantially the amount that people had contact with one another. And unfortunately, retail is one of those places where people do, even though I know most of you are following the rules religiously. But please have hope. It is a 28-day period. It happens to be one of the most important periods of the year. And I'm sorry about that. I don't control the timing of the virus. It is, so the 28-day period comes to an end. There is a great progress being made on the vaccine, and we're a very resilient city, a very resilient economy. We're still a wealthy city by every comparative, every comparison. And that wealth, much of it will still be there, and the smart people and the investment desirability of Toronto and so on. I'm very bullish on the future of our city. And I know my bullishness doesn't get you a lot of sales in the next 27 days, but I think you can be confident that coming out the other end, if we do our job to keep taxes low, to keep the spending on the part of the government reasonable and low, helping vulnerable people at the same time, to be an attractive place where we provide the supports like digital Main Street to businesses, where Premier Ford is going to bring in measures in his budget. He brought in measures that would reduce small business taxes by like 15% starting next year. Please have hope, and please just keep doing what you're doing in terms of being the excellent, business people that you are. I will be pledged to do this again with you if you'd like to do it in a few months, just because you want to have time for some questions to come up and maybe get through the pandemic. I will be a big supporter of the Dragon Boat race. I'm optimistic we're going to have the island open again with the ferries and be able to have that as per normal. But please have hope, because I think brighter days do lie ahead, and we've all got to make that happen by, last words, please stay home as much as you can. I know some of you have to go home to work to run your businesses and so on, but please encourage your families to stay home as much as possible just for the next 4 weeks. It's a long time, I know, but if we can do that, we will break the back of this thing and be much better off for it. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. And yeah, I echo Mayor Tory's words as well. And I also wanted to personally thank him for Mayor Tory for spending an hour with me and having this great chat. Hopefully next time, and we will take you up on it. Hopefully next time we'll actually be in front of a real fireside and not over this.
Exactly.
And I really find it, very insightful and very helpful when government officials talk to us and hear our important concerns. And it's been great that you've taken an hour of your time to help us through this. You've consistently shown us your desire to listen and to help Torontonians. And maybe for all the rest of the listeners here, let's try to take that lead from Mayor Tory and show our desire and our desire to listen and to help our fellow Torontonians and greater Torontonians as we navigate this pandemic together. On behalf of the Toronto Chinese Business Association, the Young Executives Network, and Mayor Tory, I'd like to thank everyone here for attending tonight's Fireside Chat. Hopefully we're able to address some of the concerns, and like Mayor Tory said, if we have an opportunity to do a second one or a third one, whenever the case is, please feel free to send our questions over. I'll pass it back to Megan quickly just to close off. But thank you.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen, for such an insightful session this evening. Again, I would like to echo Mayor Tory's message. Please, everyone, stay safe and stay well. Happy holidays, and should you have any questions, please feel free to send them over to us by email. The email is left in the chat box. So have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.